when there is silence, you can just hear the harmonious ticking noises, which is lovely. Maybe that could be our intro. Hello, and welcome to the Watch Talk channel. While this is our maiden voyage into the world of making YouTube videos, we're avid watchers of a range of channels in the watch scene, and we're really looking forward to adding what we can to this incredible community. In this first video, I'm going to be chatting to Alan Wood, founder and director of Vintage Gold Watches London, the channel sponsor of Watch Talk. Alan, it's great to see you. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Patrick. Good to see you.
Good, thank you. It's fantastic to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming along to Kensington High Street, London.
Most welcome. Yeah, beautiful place to be and beautiful place to talk about vintage watches.
Sure.
So
let's get right to it.
Let's get right to it. So, as our first channel video, please, Alan, could you just tell the audience a little bit about who you are?
Okay, sure. I'm Alan Wood, and I'm a watch guy. It's a bug. It's a passion. It's an obsession. It's something I've had as long as I can remember. Perhaps going back to my first watch, the Timex, when I was 10. But I guess my passion really started when I got to the age of 30 and I treated myself to a Longines watch. And then from there it's really gripped me. So be careful out there, guys, because this hobby can get expensive.
As an experienced dealer, perhaps, what is it that you think are some of the key factors behind what makes these watches, this passion of ours, so infectious?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's interesting. It's almost an unknown. I mean, I meet a lot of really interesting people as a watch dealer, and I talk to them about what their drivers are, and it's hard to get to the bottom of it, really. It's a bit of a mystery. But the underlying thing is that, and the thing I hear most often is that people just say, I just love watches. For certain people, it's a model that they particularly are interested in and follow. For others, it's the dial. They just fall in love with the dial of a particular watch or a brand, and for others it's just the form and the design of watch cases. For each of us it's a journey, and we find some collectors will have a broad spectrum of interests, others will just stick rigidly on one brand or even just one model. Leading
on from that, perhaps for me, there seems to be a great vintage watches in particular, seem to be quite a driving factor in between social interaction and I've made many friends through talking about watches to people and sharing this passion with fellow enthusiasts.
Yeah, I mean, you meet so many interesting people. There is true enthusiasm out there, and that's something we really want to explore with this channel and offer it as almost as a forum for people to come along and talk about watches, whether they be from the collector market or from the dealer market, or even we may have watchmakers on, hopefully, but just to chat about it, all aspects of watchmaking or watch collecting or watches in general, and perhaps even one day we'll have a brand or two along.
Absolutely. So we shouldn't neglect to mention for what a lot of people is the other side of this enthusiasm, this hobby, which is what's inside of these watches, what's under the hood perhaps. I know you've drawn parallels to other mechanical objects that you think people have equally passionate for.
There's an obvious parallel between watches and cars. I've always had a passion for Porsches, and the 911 has always been a dream car for me, and I've been fortunate enough to have owned a couple of them. So we have watches, cars, and I think cameras as well is another example of something which is a functional object, and yet people can be almost as passionate about their camera and the look of it and just handling it as they are about the photography. Swiss watches really are miracles of microengineering. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Anybody that looks inside the back of a vintage watch or even a modern watch, they're just amazing to think that people have put these things together, designed them, and not only do they work beautifully, but they work almost forever. I mean, a well-maintained watch is immortal. It's eternal. when you've used it for your lifetime, you can pass it on to somebody, and it's just a beautiful thing to own and to do.
As corny as Patek's marketing phrase of you never own a Patek, you merely look after it for the next generation.
Yeah.
You know, it's true
It is,
to an extent, just because, you know, these things, when properly maintained, will last forever, which is exciting. On the Watch Talk channel, we'll be looking to cover all ends of the watch market, so that's the vintage side of things as well as the more modern pieces. But just looking at the set of watches we have in front of us, what was it about vintage watches that really drew you towards them when it came to building a business?
I just was fascinated with watches and the history of them, and particular models. I mean, the business started really with the Oyster Perpetual, the 50s Oyster Perpetual in particular. But I felt that the vintage gold watch market wasn't really catered for in the UK. There was no real specialist focused on vintage gold watches. I think as people grow older, or at least some people, you know, they almost promise themselves secretly, perhaps, that they might have a vintage watch, or the watch that they saw in a high street window 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
It's, of course, you know, as we grow older, we can begin to afford these things. The business was really built around helping the first-time buyer, if you like, of a vintage watch into the wonderful world of vintage watches.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, John Mayer said it, didn't he? We all want to make it most in the time when we're youngest, and, you know, by time itself we can't. So I guess that's part of the attraction to vintage stuff when we move on a bit.
I guess we're lucky, you know. It's, in later life, hopefully, we can afford some of the things that we promised ourselves, or we always wanted when we were younger.
So you touched upon it there, and we will be covering gold and its use in the industry in greater detail in a future video. But for you, what is it about the precious metal that makes it so special when it comes to vintage watches?
So gold has always had a fascination for people across the ages. It was the first currency. It was the reason for the first banks. When gold got too heavy for people to carry around in their purses, and they got too much of it, they had to put it somewhere. But gold is a material which doesn't deteriorate. It lasts forever, and it's amazing to think that the gold that you see in these gold cases here, it could have been mined 50 years ago when the watch was made, but it could have been mined hundreds of years ago, or even thousands of years ago, because gold is the original recyclable material.
Absolutely, yeah.
So,
well, I've been waiting long enough. Let's get onto these watches and have a closer look at some of them. So if we may, I'd love to start with this beautiful rose gold Omega Constellation that we have here. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Sure. This is really the top of the range of Omega Constellation model, which was always the top of the range. So this is the deluxe Constellation Paipan with a solid gold dial, solid gold hour indices. It's got beautiful swept-back lugs, and it's just in stunning condition. We see these watches so seldomly. Whenever we can buy them, we will buy them. It's not for everybody. It's a very flamboyant piece, I guess, in some respects, but very special all the same.
Absolutely. I mean, the phrase museum piece is tossed about fairly frequently these days, but what is it about this Omega in particular that allows the dial to look as factory fresh as it does?
Well, it's gold, so gold doesn't deteriorate. It's been cleaned, and it's been the whole watch has just been beautifully. It's an original dial, but it's in just in beautiful condition.
Fantastic. And unlike many vintage gold watches, when we flip the watch over, we see
The observatory.
The observatory on the case back.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about why that's there?
Yeah, so this is Omega's brand within a brand almost for the Constellation range. The observatory design here, or logo, was always used for the Constellation, and they used a similar design, a maritime script for the Seamaster.
Sure, amazing. Well, let's move on to a yellow metal. We have this incredible Rolex here.
Yeah, so this is an early 50s Datejust. It was produced prior to the time when Rolex actually called the Datejust.
Right, sure.
So Rolex launched the Datejust in '48. This is a 1952 watch, I believe, with the early roulette date wheel, so that changes from red to black, which is a lovely little feature, which didn't last for long, so it's highly collectible. But just a stunning dial, a good size watch, a very, very good size watch for the time being, 36mm. So the Datejust was the world's first waterproof automatic watch with a date feature.
Yeah.
So it's quite some history behind this.
And we were discussing earlier, one of the many things that we love about Rolex is the way that they carry design language through into present day models. So if we look at the modern, the Daytonas on the Oyster Flex and the Yachtmaster, we see the sort of half end link, if you like, that's very much borrows from the design of this early Datejust in the way that it fills out the gap where we normally see a strap, just in a very pleasing way for me.
Yeah, so the Oyster case first launched in 1926, and it was more or less this shape, but it just got gradually bigger, and the Datejust was a large watch because it was an automatic with a date function, and it had to be a large watch. It was quite a statement piece in its day, because typically watches were 31, 32, 33 millimeter.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, many people talk about sports watches. The duller side of them, if you like, is that case side where there is no crown. But when you look at the Oyster case and the curvaceousness and the way the polishing is done, it's far from boring.
No, so I mean the Oyster case is a classic. It's the most important Rolex watch, the Oyster Perpetual, and certainly it's the watch which made Rolex what it is today.
Absolutely, no doubt we'll be making a detailed video on that in the future. So let's change speed a bit, quite
Sure.
literally when it comes to frequency, and move on to this Jaeger LeCoultre, the memo box.
Sure.
The two things that are immediately striking to me is firstly the choice of material. It's yellow gold,
Yeah.
and secondly the sort of quite considerable size in compared to a lot of other vintage watches.
This is a watch from 1972, and it was the world's first automatic watch with an alarm function. Not only that, but it has a date function, and not only that, but it's an automatic. So it's quite a sizable movement in there, so it had to have a large case from the beginning. But they made it 37 millimeter, which including the two crowns here, it's quite an impressive watch for the period. The alarm function is one of the complications which Jaeger LeCoultre really commercialized for the first time. There were alarms prior to this, but Jaeger LeCoultre were the first company to commercialize the alarm
Sure.
watch successfully. One other thing about this watch is it has a high beat movement.
Right.
So it runs at 28,000 beats per hour, which is quite a fast beating movement even by today's standards. And it makes the watch more accurate. We call it 28,000 beat per hour watch an 8-beat movement. The Zenith Primero, which is one of the world's fastest running watches, runs at 36,000 beats per hour, and we call that a 10-beat. Movement. So this one is beating at 8 beats per second. The Zenith El Primero beats at 10 beats per second.
Sure. So for a lot of people, one of the brilliant things about vintage watches as a hobby is the accessibility at every end of the market. So we've touched upon some fairly high value watches here, but it's important to note that it's not just about the big money pieces. Here we have a beautiful Longines in solid yellow gold that's on the more affordable scale of things, I believe.
This would be a late 50s, early 60s watch. It's 33 millimeters, I believe, so typical size for the period. This is a galoche dial Longines with some beautiful hour indices, the Dauphin hands. It's just a really stylish piece and relatively affordable.
So let's roll the timeline back and
Sure.
look at one of the older pieces that you have in your collection here. So this is what we've dubbed as the 100-year-old Rolex,
Sure.
and it's a beautiful rose gold ladies piece.
So this is a Rolex watch from the day before Rolex moved to Switzerland. They were based in London when this watch was produced.
Sure.
They imported their movements from Switzerland from a company called Reberg, which I believe in the end they bought that company. We brought it along because it's just an example of a watch which has been kept well. It's been restored back to almost new condition. It's running probably as well as the day it was made, and the movement just looks spectacular. I can open this case. This is from a time when Rolex signed their watches, both Rolex and W&D. And of course, W&D are the initials of the two founders, Wilsdorf and Davis. Rolex didn't trade exclusively under the name Rolex until the early 1920s. So it's interesting to be double signed. It's signed Rolex on the movement and it's signed Rolex on the dial. It just has these beautiful Breguet numerals, so
Fantastic.
lots of charm.
Alan, as always, it's been a pleasure talking to you about vintage watches.
And you, Patrick.
As this is our first video, maybe we should talk to the audience a bit about what our aims and aspirations for this channel is.
YouTube's a fantastic medium for spreading the word, I guess, and we're passionate about our watches, and we know there are a lot of passionate people out there, so we want to provide an enthusiast-driven platform for people to come along, chat about watches, whether it be collectors, dealers, watchmakers, anybody with an interest and something to say.
Absolutely, and on that note, if you feel you have a topic you'd like to see us discuss on the channel, or if you'd like to come on the channel yourself, either digitally or in person, do send us an email to the address that's in the description, and we'll happily get back to you and sort that out. In the meantime, give us a follow on Instagram at Watch Talk Channel, where we'll keep you up to date on the goings on behind the scenes. And also stay tuned to the channel, because we'll be releasing another great video in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you, take care, goodbye.
Bye.
Another one, thank you.